perspective of young children and bring in this perspective of how you would experience the city from that height really triggers a lot of thinking about how we can build to really plan and design in better cities for all. But what is exciting about the partnership with Arup and Jerome, it's super nice to share this space with you, because I remember when we started our partnership with Arup, and we actually designed this virtual reality that I'm going to show you a little bit about that and just share some thoughts on that as well. But when we started our partnership, we were really trying to trigger, how can we make people understand, how does it feel to live and experience a city from that perspective? But what we didn't think at that time was like the difference that you can have in experience in the city if you're in a developed neighborhood compared to a very vulnerable area in the city. So today what we're going to be discussing about the proximity of care framework is how can we really target the most vulnerable areas of the city, and how can we really think about different solutions that can help us plan and design a city, but also considering all the inequalities that we have in cities. So let me share a couple of pictures and thoughts that I always think it's nice to bring into our calls. I hope you can see this presentation. So I was telling you the first thing that we started doing with many policymakers and also like mayors and people who have the power to decide on how to design and plan a city was to actually have them test the virtual reality. So basically this virtual reality, what does is it takes you to live the experience of a city from the perspective of 95 centimeters. And even when I tested the virtual reality, I could really like see the size of a building, the size of all the different elements that you have in the immediate urban context. And it's really frightening to see the way that we're building cities, and especially when you think about the speed of cars, the loud noises, the air quality, it really kind of brings you to this like terrifying experience of how we're building cities. And when you think about the inequalities that we have in all cities around the world, then we understand what a big problem this can actually be. So as I was saying, when we started designing the proximity of care design guide, we really were thinking about which is the best way that we can tackle inequalities in cities, and how can we do in order to help policymakers truly understand how they can change the way they design and plan cities. And what you're going to see is through this conversation that we're going to be having today is that there are many different ways that we can really help policymakers and basically practitioners understand the gaps that we have in any city. And I think this is one of the most important things about the proximity of care guidelines. It really allows you to have some practical tools to understand which are the biggest gaps that we have in cities, especially when we're working in informal settlements or in humanitarian settings. I see some of our partners, I think Jonathan from Civic is in this call as well. I also see CatalyticAction that has been one of our partners in testing the tools that we have developed with Arup, and I think they're going to tell you more about what really happens in these very vulnerable areas of any city. But I think what's also really interesting in this learning process that we have developed with Arup is how can we really find and design solutions that can support communities, improve the well-being, and the access to different services. And you're going to see, and I'm not going to talk about that because I think there are other speakers. Sarah will probably be telling you more about the principles and the different components that the framework touches upon. But what I really like about these guidelines is that it really allows people to be empowered about the way they want to think of their city, the way they want to design the city. I always like using this picture that you see on the presentation, which is a picture from one of the favelas in Sao Paulo. And basically what you see there is that public space, even in a slum, in a favela, in any vulnerable city of the world, can also be this space that it can feel inclusive, can feel safe, can be the space where people can just basically feel secure to meet and just share with others. And I think this is what we want to make sure that we're building upon whenever we're working in the urban context. And finally, I do want to say that one of the most important things about the proximity of care guidelines is that one of our biggest challenges is how can we create awareness and interest and political will to really support more investment in the more vulnerable areas of our cities. And I really think that the proximity of care guidelines touches upon this objective of really developing very practical tools that can show quick wins, that can then increase the awareness of why is it important to basically work on the gaps that we have in cities, and how can we really support the most vulnerable communities to take some practical solutions and just build upon those practical solutions to improve the well-being of babies and toddlers, but in reality to improve the well-being of everyone living in a city. So this is what I wanted to share very briefly on this very first part of our talk today. Again, we're very happy to share this space with Arup. When we decided working with Arup, we were aware that Arup is a very influential partner in the urban development world. So we're really hoping that many other partners like Arup can also kind of embed this thinking into their own work, and that we can really transform the way that we plan and design cities for all. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Cecilia. And just for me to say a few words, but thank you for those kind words about working with Arup. And likewise, I think we've thoroughly enjoyed the partnership with Bernard van Leer. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But I thought I'd just present a little bit of context and observations, I suppose, about the work and why I feel it's just so important, the timing of this piece of work. I mean, we've all been living with the consequences, if you like, of the global pandemic for the last year. And I think that's done two things. One, obviously, it's caused more challenges for communities across the globe. It will be the cause, no doubt, of more migration. But it's also, perhaps more importantly, shone a lens on the challenges of communities and the trends that have actually been around, I think, for a couple of decades, as we see the numbers of displaced communities across the globe growing year on year, the numbers of refugees growing, the number of informal settlements and unplanned settlements within cities growing as a consequence. And of course, one of the principal sort of aspects of those communities is the sheer number of children that are accommodated within them. You know, some reports suggest that up to half of all of the refugees across the globe are children at the moment. And so I think, in a way, this work coinciding with the year that we've had, I think helps us, I think, bring to the fore and bring more attention to the plight of these communities, and helps us understand better how we can support and provide the resource to help transform some of their lives. I think one of the things that really struck me about the work is the shift that it takes towards a kind of development focused model, and perhaps a little bit away from the typical humanitarian model in the way in which informal settlements are conceived, planned, or adapted. And I think really broadly what that means is the bringing together of the social interactions, the social understanding for those communities, and the way in which, you know, health facilities, education facilities, etc., can be brought to bear, together with the importance of the physical environment, and the importance to recognize actually that, you know, many of the childhoods that we're talking about will take place completely in the lifespan of a child in these environments. These are not temporary settlements. We think of refugee camps perhaps as temporary camps. I think increasingly we have to recognize that they're there for a very long time. Informal settlements and the unplanned nature of the rapid growth of cities means many of the vulnerable places within our cities will be around for a very long amount of time. You know, first, second generations of childhoods will be growing up within those environments. And so we have to, I think, provide better resources, better understanding of how we can plan those places and adapt those places, not just to support individuals, but to really help them thrive and create the environments in which they can really seize opportunity and be stimulated. And of course, that principle of providing stimulating places, safe spaces, as you described them, is just so important, not just in the vulnerable parts of our cities, but for all of us across our cities. So to me, when when an adult thinks about the places they enjoy most in their physical environment, they often think about the spaces that have been designed for children, or at least with children in mind, the places that are most stimulating, the places that are safe. And as you say, I think the wonderful tool that we've been able to use, to put ourselves in the mind and in the eyes of a child, just really helps us grasp what that world can be. And in doing so, I think we're changing and helping to transform an urban environment, not just for children, but for adults alike. When we started the work with Bernard van Leer, it was before the pandemic had really taken hold. And we imagined doing it in a very, very different way. The consequence of lockdowns and the inability to travel have caused us to change, almost completely the way and the approach that the work has been done. We've had to rely much more on digital resources, remote working and remote engagement. And that's been a very big change, I think, for all involved, and has caused a real need to rapidly learn about the different techniques and the different ways in which we can share information. But I actually think it's probably resulted in a more impactful and a resource base here which really has quite significantly greater reach as a consequence. On the one hand, it's forced, I think, this notion of local delivery and just how important it is that people on the ground, communities on the ground, are given the resources to take control themselves and to implement many of the ideas and many of the principles themselves and take ownership of those in the longer term. The second is that because the digital resources, the reach is much greater. And then, of course, we've had to adopt a language which I think is understandable globally. And that's forced us to really think about the way in which we describe the principles and the means of engagement that are possible. And finally, I think that remote learning and the remote engagement means we can bring a whole variety of different skills and disciplines to bear to support the work, which might not have been possible if we'd been relying on in-person type engagement. So for me, it signals not just an incredible piece of work in our partnership, but actually it's caused us in Arup to change the way we're delivering work across the globe. And importantly, it's changed the way in which we look at our own community engagement program in its wider sense. And we're doing a conversion much more to that remote learning, that remote resource provision. So I hope it's providing a real benchmark for others to look at in the way in which we can really grasp some of the opportunities that brings. But ultimately, the work remains human-centered. It brings, to my mind, the built environment on a par in importance with social considerations for communities. And importantly, it's grounded in local communities taking ownership of engagement, delivery, and ownership of the outcomes of that work. And finally, a quick word about just how much we've really valued the relationship with Bernard van Leer. Wonderful partner to work with. I know it's been a real pleasure for the team, and it's felt really like a true partnership. In the way in which we've been able to exchange ideas, challenge each other, and shape the outcomes. I think the bringing together of two mindsets who are used to working in different environments is a lesson for us all, and it's certainly a lesson I'll be taking back into the day-to-day work that Arup does across the globe. And that bringing together of different thought processes, I think, has resulted in a really, really different piece of work, which in terms of its practical use, I think will go a lot further. And so I hope that partnership can continue. I hope that the listeners today can take a huge amount from the work that we've done. And I hope actually the reach can continue in the way in which I've described. Just to quote the beginning lines, the opening lines, if you like, of that piece of work, which I think are just so important: understand, design, and influence. They have real resonance to me, and I'll leave you with those thoughts.
Thanks so much, Ceci. Thanks so much, Jerome. It's been great to hear your thoughts about the partnership and how the work has unfolded. Before I hand over to the talented Arup team, I just wanted to let everyone know that there is interpretation available on this call. So on the bottom bar, you'll see a globe and you're able to select either Spanish, Arabic, or Portuguese in case you haven't found it so far. And before I do hand over, we quickly wanted to run a poll because we know how important collaboration is. We see how many amazing and diverse people are on this call from different countries, from different cities, but we also want to see where they are from in terms of the organizations that they represent. So there's a quick poll online. If you guys want to take a quick minute, I know that it's very difficult to place yourselves into a particular box, but it's always interesting to see the diversity of viewpoints that we have on this call. And of course, the proximity of care is designed to bring these different groups together and to work collaboratively on creating spaces and places that really support child development and foster communities. So I'm going to give it another 30 seconds, and I encourage you all to make sure that you are visible in the group. Perfect. I see we have a lot of urban designers on the call, over 50%, and a lot of humanitarian and development organizations. And obviously, because the proximity of care focuses on vulnerable and refugee settlements, it really makes sense. I'm going to share the results so that you guys can all see them. Also a couple of early childhood specialists, and it's always great to have government authorities, cities, and decision makers with us on the call to make them aware of how important all of this work really is. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the talented and very diverse Arup team, Sarah, Spencer, Sachin, and Pedro, to introduce the proximity of care design guides and walk you through how to use them.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Hannah, for facilitating. Thanks, Jerome and Cecilia, for the introduction. Maybe you could move to the couple of slides. The next one. Yeah, the next one. Yeah, and the next one is the last one. Yeah. So basically, adding to what Cecilia and Jerome just said, before introducing the design guide, I'd just like to give you some additional background information on why we decided to develop it and the approach that we use. Basically, our work has been driven by three main questions or challenges. The first one is about how Arup's total design approach can be used to improve the living conditions of vulnerable urban context. So Arup's concept of total design is a multidisciplinary approach to design, which implies that greater results, greater solutions can be accomplished when technical knowledge, design, aesthetic unite, and when all professionals join forces right from the start. So as it was said, the guide is considering two typologies of vulnerable contexts, which are informal refugee settlements, because there is an increasing number of people, in particular children, living in there, as Jerome just said. And these contexts can be very different, but they are very complex urban environments, and they present multiple competing challenges, such as pollution, crime, absence of green space, of public spaces, and also the significant impact of climate change. At the same time, these places also are sites of great creativity, innovation, and resilience. So in order to address this complexity and multiple challenges, competing challenges, and in order to untap existing opportunities, we saw that a multidisciplinary and a system approach is required. Next slide. The second question we aim to address through our work is how can we help improving the well-being of the most vulnerable groups in this context, in particular young children, caregivers, and pregnant women, while at the same time taking into account and considering the needs of the broader population. So currently, millions of children live in informal settlement, and they are at risk of not attaining their developmental potential. And nearly half of the global refugee population are children, of which 4.25 are under the age of 5. So in this context, the needs of the youngest, the most vulnerable, often they go unheard in decision-making and planning. And the early years of children in particular are so important for their healthy physical and mental development. So how can we basically make sure that the specific needs of this group of the population are heard and taken into account by urban practitioners and decision makers? And how can we make sure that urban interventions cater to the developmental needs of young children? Next slide. The next question that we aim to address through our work is how can we help improving collaboration among professionals working in this context? And how can we encourage a systems approach to urban regeneration? So based on our work, what we saw is that urban practitioners working in vulnerable contexts, they tend to have to focus their work mainly on the basic needs of the population, on the functional needs of the residents. And so the infrastructure, the service that they deliver, they normally do not consider the developmental needs of children in particular. On the other hand, what we saw is that specialists on early childhood development and programs focusing on early childhood development. They mainly focus on educational facilities and services or programs, healthcare, nutrition, and programs that are very important, but they don't consider enough the role that the built environment actually play in terms of children development. So what we try to do is to see is that by promoting greater collaboration and the system approach, more can be achieved together. Next slide. So the proximity of care design guide that we're launching today is actually aiming to create a common language, a common ground for collaboration. So we are trying to, what we're trying to do is to translate complex concepts, different languages used by different experts into tangible, practical, user-friendly principles and tools that city governments, urban practitioners, early childhood development specialists, and also professionals from the humanitarian development sector can use to work together and to create through their work more healthy, supportive, stimulating, and protective urban environments where children can thrive. And of course, taking into account the benefits for the entire community. Next slide. So the guide was compiled after extensive research, and also we conduct field work with the support of local partners. In fact, we work across 4 sites in Kenya, Lebanon, Jordan, and South Africa, and partnering with experienced organizations such as CatalyticAction in Lebanon, Civic in Jordan, KDI in Kenya, and VPU in South Africa. Next slide. No, yeah, and as you can see, this has been a team effort. We brought together different expertise, people from Arup and experts from different organizations with different background, different knowledge and skills. And we all work together, challenge each other, stimulating each other to develop this guide. Next slide. And also to make the guide more user relevant, we also established technical review committee with a selected group of experts and decision makers from both city governments, humanitarian development sectors, which I would like to thank for their support. We've been engaging them through the process, organizing workshops with them, sharing the progress of the work and receiving feedback, very positive feedback that we have introduced and considered into the guide. So now I'd like to ask my colleague Spencer to present the proximity of care approach. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thank you also to Hannah, Cecilia, and Jerome for your introductions. So the heart of our efforts for the past 2 years is the proximity of care approach, or POC. This is a new, multidimensional and evidence-based approach for assessing the relationship between urban systems and a child's development. It can also be used to identify relevant interventions and opportunities to enhance childhood development in any given context. It's a unique approach because it takes the caregiver and their child as a dyad. So as we all know, a child is the product of their support system and the environment around them. But equally, a caregiver's ability to provide good conditions for their child is determined by emotional, financial, and social factors. And it's through POC that we can begin to understand these interdependencies. In doing so, POC assesses how the built environment, public spaces, mobility routes, and other so-called hard factors affect the caregiver-child dyad. But we can also begin to look at how professional opportunities and training, social cohesiveness, and government support affect and influence the dyad. Next slide, please. So I encourage you to think of POC not as a circle, but as a deep cylinder with numerous layers. The 4 dimensions on the outer ring, health, protection, stimulation, and support, are core overarching elements that create optimal conditions for children to develop and grow up in. Below each of those 4 dimensions are 4 goals. There are 16 goals in total, and these provide a more detailed reference point for what must be achieved under each of those dimensions. Each goal is then informed by various factors, and these are discrete characteristics or elements in a specific place that can help create optimal conditions for early childhood development. And then lastly, in each factor sit a set of indicators, which comprise qualitative, quantitative, and spatial measures. And these can be observed at 3 different levels, which I'll speak to in a minute. Next slide, please. But to zoom in quickly on the 4 dimensions that make up the POC approach, health looks at a child's nutrition, their access to wash services, and other elements that contribute to an enriching and healthy environment for optimal early childhood development. Protection includes the elements that contribute to a safe and secure environment for children. This can include a child's immediate physical safety, but also broader things like their community's resilience to climate disasters and hazards. Stimulation considers the elements that create a nurturing environment for caregivers and their children. This can include the cognitive interaction a child has with their caregiver on a daily basis, but it can also include whether there's adequate space for learning and play within close proximity of the household. And then support involves all elements that create a knowledgeable and supportive environment for optimal early childhood development. And there's a real focus here on enhancing knowledge and data management at both the city and the community level, as well as integrating caregivers in inclusive decision-making processes. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, each of these dimensions are assessed at 3 levels, starting at the household level, which is an intimate and personal space where the child experiences the largest amount of stimulation on a day-to-day basis. And also in some contexts for caregivers, and I'm sure for most of us on this call, the household can also be a place of work. We then look at the neighborhood level. And this is a more communal space that includes local service providers, community members, and other people that the caregiver and the child are interacting with quite regularly. And then lastly, we look at the city level. This is a more distributed and institutional space. And while the caregiver and the child may not visit it as frequently, it's at this level that the policies which affect their lives are designed and implemented. And the city level therefore bears considerable influence on the caregiver-child dyad. Next slide, please. Crucially, proximity of care comes with a supporting toolkit, which we've developed and tested with the local partners in Jordan, Kenya, Lebanon, and South Africa. And the various tools we've designed allow you to conduct participatory mapping and research exercises. And the objective behind them is to elevate community needs and perspectives during the assessment, design, and implementation stages of a project. Using the toolkit builds a comprehensive understanding of your focus site's performance using the POC indicators, factors, and goals. And this is actually captured in the proximity of care framework, of which there's a screenshot in the slide. This is an Excel matrix in which users can plan research, conduct gap analyses, score a focus site against the POC, and more. And with that, I'll hand over now to Sachin and Pedro to run us through the proximity of care design guide.
Thank you, Spencer. So now to just introduce the guide itself. So first of all, I think it's worth saying that we made the guide digital. We wanted to make it digital because we wanted it to be accessible to a global audience. We didn't want to be limited by having to print it, to send it, to update it, and even having developed it as a website forced us to make the language bite-sized. And that's something that we heard from the users, that everyone needed everything to be done and understood in very small chunks, very easy to understand guidance, and also the guidance to grow over time. So hence the entire guidance is delivered in the form of a website. The digital medium also allows our users to navigate the guidance both in a linear way, as well as dip into it and get exactly what they're looking for, whether you're looking for tools, whether you're looking for a process, whether you're looking for case studies. And a third thing that we discovered in designing the guide was that that users would like to discover things like unexpected pieces of knowledge through the digital medium. So hence, these were the kind of principles that allowed us to design the guide and put it up as on the website, which I will share in half a minute. But again, I think just to emphasize in terms of the structure, and as Jerome mentioned, and also Cecilia mentioned, in terms of what we mean by design, first and foremost, for us, design starts with understanding. Hence, included within the guidance, which is on planning and the built environment, we start with understanding. Then for design to have a lasting impact, we also consider the guidance on how to influence stakeholders, influence policy, as well as how to scale up the interventions beyond small site-based projects. Hence, the guidance is structured under 3 headings, mainly understand, design, and influence. And this is what forms the core of the guide. And when you go onto the website, you'll find basic information about this initiative. You'll find all the detailed information about the proximity of care approach that Spencer just presented. And then particularly under the three headings of understand, design, and influence, we'll find guidance of how to best support early childhood development through built environment interventions. All of this guidance is underpinned by principles, again, as Cecilia mentioned earlier. So under each of the three understand, design, and influence sections, you'll find principles, you'll find case studies, you'll find tools, you'll find things that are organized in this way so that it's easier to access, but also to encourage the discovery process. You will hear more about this from my colleague Pedro in a second.
Hi, everyone. Now we will briefly show you a couple of key features that you'll find across the understand, design, and influence sections of the guide, namely the guiding principles, the case studies of best practice, and the practical tools that you'll find at the lower end of each of these sections. Let's jump into the guiding principles, for example, for designing interventions. These principles will help you design more effective and context-sensitive ways to generate outcomes for your project beneficiaries and the broader community. These 5 in particular touch upon themes like health, safety, infrastructure, facilitating mobility, and nature-based solutions. Let's take a look at the principle of connecting the community inside and out. Clicking on the plus, we can expand this to read how this principle is about putting the mobility of young children, their caregivers, and pregnant women at the center of your intervention. And also, you can find bite-sized guidance on how to implement this from a range of aspects. If you want to better understand how the localization of your intervention plays a key role, you expand again to get more detailed guidance. And because we wanted this guidance to be tangible, each of these how-to recommendations will be accompanied with a case study of best practice, where something similar was actually implemented. If we click on the case study, it will take us to a summary of the case and learnings from the design or implementation of this particular project. These learnings range across topics like spatial and visual elements, materiality, the process of engagement or implementation, or like we said before, things like location. You can also find useful links if you want to go deeper or to know more about the work of the organization that did this project. If you find the case relevant to the work you're doing, you can share a direct link with a colleague or share on social media. If we close the case study, we're back at the how-to guidance to keep exploring other recommendations, or you can keep exploring other principles and their how-to recommendations. So these are the guiding principles and case studies that we think that will be very useful to achieve better outcomes for your interventions. And remember, you'll find tailored principles for designing, but also for understanding needs and for influencing others around you to adopt and promote these practices. Now that we've covered guiding principles and case studies, let's take a look at the practical tools that you'll find at the lower end of each of these sections. Let's take a look at the practical tools, for example, offered to undertake an assessment. These ones will help you understand the factors that contribute to making a vulnerable context more child-friendly and family-friendly. Scrolling down, you'll find a number of practical tools that you can tap into directly, or that you can follow as 4 suggested phases of assessment, namely test-based analysis, site visit, engagement with the community, and finally, reporting the data that has been gathered. Some examples of tools that support an assessment are guidance on how to undertake a transect walk or a household survey at a site visit, or guidance to support a focus group discussion, or a more playful activity like photo contest to engage children and caregivers. One final example is probably one of the most robust tools offered, the proximity of care framework, that will help you deliver a consistent evaluation of the data collected and the factors that influence early childhood development within a site context. Each of these tools can be explored deeper by clicking on them and downloaded for paper-based use in contexts where digital access might be limited, or for digital but offline use. And as we mentioned before, tools like this can be found to support an assessment process, but also a design process, or to support advocating for early childhood development in urban and vulnerable urban contexts. So feel free to navigate these practical tools through these 3 sections, or as mentioned before, you can also discover more resources through the full catalog of tools at the Get Inspired sections that collects all of these tools, as well as all the case studies present throughout the guide, plus knowledge products and inspiring ideas. Now, feel free to go for yourself to proximityofcare.com to explore all these resources and share with others.
Thanks, Pedro, for walking us through the proximity of care design guide. We wanted to give everyone a chance to kind of do a bit of exploration for yourself. So in the chat, you'll see there's a link that will take you directly to the website. There's about 5 minutes for you guys to click around and explore. Also, if you have any questions about it, feel free to come back to the call and add it in the chat box. And while you guys are exploring, we're going to play a background video for you as well. So if I can call everyone to come back to the Zoom call. We know that the design guide is really interesting to explore and there's tons to unpack. And we hope that you'll also explore and go back after today's launch. And that hopefully it's already started to spark some ideas for collaboration as well as exploration in the work that you're currently doing in informal and in refugee settlements. But we wanted to kind of deep dive and really look into kind of what this looks like on the ground. And through the development of the proximity of care, we have worked together with Arup with some amazing partners who've joined us on today's call to kind of share how they've adopted and implemented the work that is visible in the proximity of care approach. So it's my pleasure to first introduce Jack Campbell-Claus, the design director of KDI, who's going to be sharing some of the work that was happened in Kenya. Joanna Debadge is also going to join us from CatalyticAction, and then also after that, Musin Al-Bawab from Civic will join. But first off to Jack, you have the floor.
Thanks, Hannah. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. As Hannah mentioned, my name is Jack Campbell-Claus. I am the design director here in Nairobi, my home city, with the Kunkuri Design Initiative, which is KDI. Slide, please. Yeah, thanks. Just a quick bit about KDI. KDI is a non-profit design and community development organization. We partner with under-resourced communities to advance equity and to activate unrealized potential in neighborhoods and cities. And we do that through our 4 service areas, which are design and build, plan and program, advocate and educate, and research and test. Slide, please. KDI has offices in California and in Stockholm and here in Nairobi, where we were founded. Our Kenya team is very diverse, both in terms of expertise and training, but also in terms of background. And actually 8 of our full-time staff have grown up in informal settlements, where most of our work in Kenya is focused. Slide, please. So this is Kibera. This is one of the world's largest informal settlements. It's very close to Nairobi city center, and it's home to more than 250,000 people. Slide, please. Living in Kibera is uncertain, it's dangerous, and it's fraught with inequality. This photo was taken in 2019, and the family watches as the remainder of their neighborhood is demolished. Slide, please. But there is an undeniable energy, positivity, and friendliness within the communities. And it's through this latent potential of the communities that we work with a unique participatory process to understand, to advocate, to design, to build, to inform, and to advance equity in the settlement. Slide, please. KDI has been working with self-organizing community groups in Kibera since 2006 on a project called Kibera Public Space Project. The result is a network of community-initiated, designed and built social and economic hubs. It's a vision for resident-led and networked improvements. Slide, please. With our long-standing presence and experience in Kibera and with collaborations with Arup going back many years, we were eager to apply and test the proximity of care approach at 2 levels, which are the neighborhood level and the household scale or level. We tested the approach to understand and to design for Kibera. We reviewed and trialed a framework of objectives, adopting and testing some of the tools from the toolkit. We used the assessment approach that led us to understand the challenges and opportunities for early childhood development at these 2 scales in Kibera. We identified and structured opportunities for enhancing the living conditions of young children, their caregivers, and pregnant women. and developed design and planning recommendations for strategic spatial interventions to realize the opportunities. Slide, please. Starting at the city scale, this is Nairobi. The population is just over 4.5 million, but there's an estimated 2.5 million people living in one of the many informal settlements shown up in purple here. And actually, informal settlements house almost 60% of the population of the city, and that's on less than 5% of the developed city area. Slide, please. Within Kibera, we focused on the village of Makina, which is the top left here, for the application of the approach at the neighborhood level. Makina is one of 13 villages that make up Kibera, and is one of the oldest is the oldest village in Kibera. Slide, please. And actually, in fact, we have an aerial photograph of Makina that was taken in 1948, and so that makes Makina not only Kibera's oldest, but also one of Nairobi's oldest settlements. Click, please. And so the image on the right with the 2015 structures overlaid in yellow shows that the structures of the village remains close to that of the first settlers. Slide, please. So responding to the guidance, we collected data and mapped it across the neighborhood. This map on the left describes the village in regards to the health dimension, for instance, and the map on the right describes data collected on the health dimension, but now going to the household scale. And this is based on household surveys conducted between 2018 and 2020. And the area within that 100-meter radius there is called Vuma. This area is also home to the 11th Kibera Public Space Project, which is recently completed and brings much needed amenity and opportunities to the area. But it's also the area where we're able to apply the approach at the household level. Next slide, please. So we followed the approach and used the toolkit to make further assessments of the neighborhood and at the household scales, including those on this slide, and I won't go into them right now. Next slide, please. So using the approach required us to compile detailed qualitative and quantitative data that led to a number of key findings under each dimension. And this laid the ground for us to start thinking about what a responsive design solution would be in this particular context, and what key principles that could drive those interventions could be, and that are consistent with the proximity of care approach and tailored to the Vuma neighborhood issues as they stand. So I won't go into all of these, but as one example, under support, we found that challenge was unstable income or financial instability, of course, contributing to increased stress. So next slide. And that challenge related to the opportunity identified under support again, that is to build on the existing community support systems to advance savings and learning programs. Next slide, please. And sorry, I can't go into more detail on those. So we were, like many, heavily impacted by the COVID restrictions at the time of testing the approach, especially in the engagement part of it. And so we're unable to hold our typical stakeholder co-design workshops, but we were keen to use the learnings from the assessment to influence design and planning considerations at the site Vuma that I was describing earlier. So we had an internal co-design process with the research, design and planning teams in KDI, and used the assessment data and challenges and opportunities to develop design recommendations and interventions at 2 scales. Next slide, please. So At the village scale, we explored what the process would mean in terms of planning and design interventions. Slide, please. This schematic looks into several interventions to coordinate with the dimensions of the framework and to initiate some Kibera-specific principles. For instance, by positioning child-dedicated space away from major risk as an intervention, but also including multifunctionality by providing a community gathering at routine relevant times. We started to reveal a principle around having dedicated and appropriate spaces, resources and services for children, caregivers and pregnant women. We found that the interventions coming out of the approach didn't solely fit within one principle, however. So this idea of gathering space overlaying child-dedicated space also work to the advantage of community surveillance and security, for instance. Next slide, please. And so at the neighborhood scale, we critiqued and re-evaluated the design of the 11th Kibera Public Space project that was in construction at the time of testing. Next slide. This project has been designed and built in partnership with the residents of Vuma. The project features a community hall, a public plaza, water selling businesses, a playground, and sanitation block, among other things. And as part of the design process for the site, we had dedicated workshops with children and women, and assessed the process and design of the site using the framework. There were several early childhood development design and planning aspects pulled out in this graphic, but I will just highlight one. So the community engagement process informed us to maintain sightlines between the spaces used for play and the adult spaces or caregiver spaces as were defined by the community. So this provided passive adult supervision opportunities, but also offered protection and safety to the children. Next slide, please.
Hi, Jack. I'm just going to note that you have 30 seconds to wrap up.
That's fine. 3 slides left, I think. This is the final product of the KPSP, the Kibera Public Space Project, with community hall, public plaza, playground, and behind that wall is a sanitation block. Next slide. Looking over the roofs and looking into the neighborhood which this site provides for, but in the foreground we have the sanitation block cubicles. Next slide, please. And that's it. And so I just wanted to say thank you to Arup and Bernard van Leer for bringing KDI and the communities that we work alongside into this fantastic process and team. So thanks a lot for that.
Thanks so much, Jack. Joanna, do you want to take over?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful event, and thank you for inviting us to collaborate on this very crucial project. I am Joanna Dabaj. I'm co-founder of CatalyticAction, a charity that works to empower vulnerable children and their communities through participatory built intervention. I am Lebanese and I grew up in El Mina, so I'm very happy about this project. And I'm happy to say that what we learned throughout this research is now being used to actually implement physical intervention in my hometown. Next. Our first step, next slide, thank you. No, before, yeah. Our first step in adopting the proximity of care framework was to understand how we were going to address the diversity in this project. This was particularly important for the context of MENA that is diverse on so many levels. So we started by setting the number of people that we wanted to engage with, together with defining their profile. We wanted to engage with all the different vulnerable groups living in the city, including Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees, and vulnerable Lebanese. As MENA is also very diverse in terms of the built environment, we decided to conduct field work in 3 different neighborhoods that reflected this diversity of the built environment: the informal settlement of Hay el-Tanak, next, a social housing neighborhood of Al-Masakin, and next, a historical neighborhood close to the city center, which is characterized by its high density, called Hay al-Nusha. Next. Once the area and the target groups were set, we then moved to review in details the POC framework and provided a first round of comments based on our knowledge of the local context. In parallel to this, we also ran a desktop research focusing on collecting relevant context info while also focusing on the specific topics addressed by the framework. Jump, I will use other words than next, so to make it a bit more interesting. This helped us identify possible data gaps, but it also highlighted what indicators needed editing in order to be better suited to the local context. In order to be able to answer indicators through fieldwork, we developed a set of questions which had to be easily understood by our target group and also adequate to the local context. This process led us to remove many indicators from the interview questionnaires, as they would have led to sensitive and/or potentially distressing questions. These indicators were instead highlighted for focus group discussions with other key stakeholders, such as NGOs, or for further desktop research. Jump. At some point in this process, after having conducted a number of interviews and focus groups, we felt that we needed to expand our knowledge on the issues presented in the POC framework, and in particular in relation to the experience of mothers and pregnant women in MENA. In our case, it helped a lot to have one of our team members being a mother herself and currently lives in the area with her 2 children. So during this process, we discussed the challenges that she faced as a mother in this context. This process helped us a lot in attempting to grasp the potential challenges that mothers, especially from vulnerable neighborhoods, are facing in MENA. And from this internal brainstorming process, we decided to adapt some of the questions to better respond to the local context. In particular, considering that the final task of the project was to come up with design solutions, we adapted the questions to still be linked to indicators, but also more linked to the built environment and how the built environment has an impact on the well-being of the target group. Skip. COVID was clearly a challenge for this project. Most of the fieldwork had to be adapted to be conducted remotely, and thanks to a network of NGOs and trusted stakeholders such as local doctors, we managed to collect telephone numbers of people that we wanted to interview. So for example, an NGO would call a mother that they're already working with to introduce her to our research project and ask her if she accepts that we conduct an interview with us. And if she agreed, then we had the consent to call her and conduct the interview. COVID was not just a methodological challenge, but also a real life struggle for many of the people we interviewed who lost their jobs because of it. This made many interviews challenging to conduct, as COVID added an extra burden on families who were already affected by the economic crisis in Lebanon. So as you can imagine, many people we interviewed struggled to think about anything else but meeting their basic needs. In other cases, people were happy to simply talk to someone about their needs and the needs of their children. Move. Caregivers and key stakeholders highlighted urgent needs linked to food security, healthcare, and education. Alongside these needs, the needs of public spaces often came from a practical need to have a space where children can play and caregivers can meet up with families and friends. For many of the people interviewed, the space of home is not sufficient to conduct these activities, and in particular in informal settlement where families often live in small and overcrowded spaces. When it comes to using public spaces, caregivers pointed out that proximity is key, as commuting can be difficult, often dangerous for children, and sometimes financially not feasible. Jump. The Corniche of Elmina is the only public space where families from different nationalities and social classes meet. The Corniche extends 7 kilometers, and its proximity to many vulnerable neighborhoods make it the perfect public space to start addressing the needs highlighted during the assessment. Nevertheless, it lacked needed infrastructure such as paved areas, ramps, benches, shades, greenery, etc., which prevents many people from using it. Jump. Through minimal adaptations, for example, access ramps, the Corniche can also be transformed into a safe mobility infrastructure And this would enable safe access to key services such as schools and health facilities. Next. To maximize the use of the suggested interventions along the corniche, safe links between each neighborhood and the corniche must be established. Jump. We then came up with interventions to spread along the corniche, and in particular in strategic locations, which are located near the most vulnerable neighborhoods. These ideas have been developed based on the input received from interviews, focus group discussions, as well as from our experience of implementing similar projects in Lebanon. We have introduced elements that improve safe mobility, play opportunities, as well as features dedicated specifically to caregivers and pregnant women. Next, as we have secured funding to implement some of these interventions, the design ideas would now need to be reviewed with local community through a participatory design process. Next. To conclude with, we are moving forward with this initiative as this is something that we believe would highly impact the well-being of children and their caregivers living in MENA. We are soon kickstarting the participatory design phase of this project with a team of trained citizen scientists with the research center, Code Relief Center. We are hoping to implement these interventions hopefully by the end of the year, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Joanna. Now handing over to Musen from Jordan and Civic.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Never thought I'd be presenting to 200 people in my own bedroom, so this is going to be a very exciting experience for me. Thank you all. Thank you for Arup and all the other partners and BVL for including us in this event and this beautiful experience. Throughout my presentation today, I'm going to take you through a small introduction of what we've done for the past 2 years with our project Azraq Alive. And we're going to be talking about how we experienced with the proximity of care approach within Azraq, which is located in north of Jordan. Next slide, please. When we're talking about Civic, a sentence that will constantly be somewhere out there in the background is unleashing untapped potential. And that was more or less what we were hoping to constantly work with when it comes to the proximity of care approach. Next, please. Within Civic, what we like the mentality that we walked into with was that the world and the locations and the context that we're working with already has whatever it takes to address the most pressing challenges. And therefore, that makes our mission is to activate what the community already has. And like the defining insight for us was more or less that this community and what we are facing in general in the world is that it's a crisis not just of resources, but also of wasted potential, talent, spaces, and ideas. Next, please. Our journey in Azraq has been all over the place. We've worked in different, our experience transverses different fields that starts with making different public spaces, to creating maker spaces, to building platforms for people to share and co-design, and ending with providing services. So that has definitely enriched our experience with working with the POC framework. Next, please. Another input, so let's just slightly shift into the proximity of care. And when you see these two circles together, the one on the left is more or less the spheres of impact and the framework that we commonly work with within our Azraq Alive. And it's a very interesting diagram because we know that at the center for both of our approaches was the childhood and parenthood that expands into the neighborhood and its larger level. Within the proximity of care, it takes it one extra level above, which is to understand how the city works and how all of these things have intersected within each other is something that has solidified our approach while working with the proximity of care. Next slide, please. So for the next slide, instead of actually just talking about our design intervention, I want to talk about what we've learned of throughout, the key findings from working with this approach. And subliminally, we hope that you guys can understand how it was to work with the POC framework. As mentioned before, the POC has 3 different pillars. So we start with understand, design, influence. So the first one, when it comes to understand, it was understand to adapt. And it was very important for us to look at what already exists within the community and what matters the most to the communities that actively links to livelihood. Because we do believe in the importance of livelihood in creating and giving us the ability to create sustainable and realistic design decisions. Next, please. A huge part of our understanding phase was for us to do a proper desk research and lots of phone calls that included mapping and engaging unlikely allies within the actual community that we are working with, be that through workshops, calls, or actually using just our normal network. Next, please. Since we've been stuck at home, COVID hit us working here. We had like WhatsApp.
Hi, Musin. I think we're having technical difficulties hearing you. I'll give you another minute to see if it can be resolved. If there's anyone else from Civic who could potentially take over.
Hi, I can take over until Muhsin is back. I'm not sure if you can hear me either.
We can hear you, Claudine. Please go ahead.
Okay, so as Muhsin was saying, during working under COVID restrictions, we also had to embrace digital as we go. Next, please.
Hello?
Muhsin, you're back?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
I'm very sorry. The internet connection in Jordan has been very messy for the past bit. Apologies for that disconnection. Within the second pillar, within design, which was designed to transform, an important aspect that we've learned throughout this process that has actively helped in building our own capacities while working with this was the power of enabling infrastructure. Though we have already created like a makerspace that, and we have worked with community investment funds in the past, that suddenly was pushed as a great tool for creating better decisions regarding what already exists within the community itself. Next slide, please. Once again, you're going to hear me say this like 400 times throughout this entire thing, and it's that building with what we already have. Working with the proximity of care has more or less inspired us to do some trials on our own, like on the side, like what happens if we just build with rammed earth, and what happens if we see that already, we know that this skill exists. What happens if we experiment a little bit with it? Thank God for these questions that have helped us more or less guide this process. Next slide. A huge part of it was building the platform and through parenting labs for co-designing and building solutions. Next slide, please. Finally, ending with influencing, which is something that has been really important for us in general, which is through empowering caregivers to cater to their children. How do we do that? By igniting unlikely allies around a common purpose. Next, please. Trying to go as fast as possible. How do we do that? Through through inspiring an own sense of agency. How do we do that? By giving them the kits to allow them to make their own choices and transform their own spaces. Next slide, please. How do you communicate with the community? Through transformative stories to influence behavior and imaginations within the different caregivers, women, and children that we're working with. Next slide, please. And this was just the beginning. Using the proximity of care framework has helped us to more or less create a new model of how we consider data collection as much as we consider the outcome of the actual design process that we are going to go to and to use for transforming different neighborhoods within these vulnerable communities, be that within a camp or within a town itself. Next slide, please. So this leads us pretty much to the design proposal. For our design proposals, we have picked the Tatweer neighborhood, which was a royal initiative that started quite a while ago, which was based around giving different residents within a heavily vulnerable area within the Azraq town, different housing units. Of course, all of this was created while keeping the proximity of care approach and these pillars in mind. Next slide, please. How does this translate into how we work? It starts with building design presets. What do we have? What do we understand? We had to more or less collect these different points and synthesize them as main design principles that can more or less be injected into the framework. The next thing that we more or less suffered while going is like, what is the area? We know that there's this huge neighborhood. And we decided to go with this elongated, almost 2 kilometers long area that we used Architecture 101 with Kevin Lynch's approaches to understanding a city and understanding the image of the city by thinking of what were the landmarks that people are like surrounding themselves with and identifying with. What are those nodes and what are those paths and how can those paths come together to create a network of different functions. All of this disk work analysis and all of this data collection has helped us arrive at a design proposal statement. Next slide, please. The design proposal statement was more or less to create an enhanced urban experience for mothers, caregivers, and young children through an underserviced neighborhood in Azraq. Through a selection of easy to create elements connected through a path that makes the neighborhood a destination rather than just a marginalized area that people have to escape. What does this mean in actual words that humans use? Next slide, please. In frank terms, this needs citizen-led transformation, digitally powered data capture, connecting what already exists within this community, what values, local skills, and how can we adjust to those local patterns that already exist, building what we have, enabling a sense of agency within the community that we are working with through simple kits of parts that allows people to create themselves, and finally, ending with releasing untapped potential. And this is pretty much the spirit of our project Azraq Alive and the spirit of the proximity of care framework. And well, I guess that we have 2 slides left and I'm done. Thank you so much. This is the end. Please, I know that we don't have enough time, but if you have any questions, please, we're more than willing to answer them later on. Thank you, Hannah.
Thanks so much, Mohsin, and you've opened it up nicely for our Q&A. So I'm going to ask us to stop sharing the slides, and so we can all see each other. We had a couple of questions come through in the chat. The first one that came through, I think, was looking at why these particular pilots or partners were selected. I know, Sarah, that you shared some information in the chat, but maybe if you want to share for everybody, what was the thinking behind selecting these particular sites?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Thanks for the question. That's a very pertinent one. So when we decided to start this journey, we were looking for different case studies to have like a good distribution of from a geography point of view, but at the same time to consider different type of settings. So that's why we wanted to have like 2 informal settlements, 2 refugee settlements to analyze, so that we could get a good understanding of the key characteristics, elements, challenges, and also opportunities in this context. And in doing that, we were also looking at local partners with a solid experience working those contexts, with a good network and presence in those contexts. At the same time, they already experienced working with children. So we basically wanted to work with these partners. And so that's why we identified these partners, because VPU is also one of the partners. Didn't do a presentation, but for instance, they're based in Kalicha in Cape Town, and they've been doing amazing work in relation to upgrading, regenerating public spaces in Kalicha. They've been doing a lot of work on early childhood development. So basically, we wanted to have a good mix of geography representation, at the same time working with partners who knew already what they were doing, because the development of the guide has been a journey for learning for everyone, and bring together expertise, knowledge, and capacities to challenge each other and to learn from each other. That's why we wanted to have this diversity of experience and diversity of partners, but still partners with a good knowledge and capacity to deliver this type of work in this context.
Super, thanks, Sarah. There was another question that came up from Tim to the presenters from the pilot projects, if traffic played a big role in some of your design interventions and how they affected young children and families in the particular areas that you explored.
Hi, Hannah. Thanks.
Oh, Jack, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I think I got spotlighted. Yeah, no, I mean, I think I've put some a quick reply in the chat, but I can kind of share a bit more on that. A lot of the informal settlements that we work in, there haven't historically been easily trafficked roads, and recently there have been a lot more of those roads. And roads are fantastic for a lot of things, services and access in particular. But the methods and the standards of which those roads are being built in are really not considering the users, and especially we're seeing a lot of additional risk to children within the informal settlements where there isn't any side, to the roads. It's road, and then and then housing, and children are playing in the roads. It's one of their largest open spaces that they have to play. So it's really anyway. And as I said in the chat there, we're advocating hard at the moment with the Nairobi Metropolitan Services, who is our city leadership, government leadership, to try to get alongside a bunch of other partners in Nairobi to try and get better standards for road design that are inclusive and also integrated with other infrastructure as well, which might include something like public space.
Thanks, Jack. Moose and Joanna, anything you'd like to add?
Though traffic, sorry, interrupted. The traffic has been a very important aspect that you have to take care of, and I'm really glad that you said this, Jack, because this issue of street to plot is very evident within most of these vulnerable areas that we're working with. So this was taken into consideration when picking out these locations that we've talked to in the presentation earlier, and how the influence aspect is the most important one when campaigning for a better traffic situation within these areas, particularly in talking to the authorities that are responsible and influencing people and giving them the language to more or less demand a better environment themselves. Joanna, I'm very sorry. Go ahead.
No worries. Actually, this was a point that was worry from most of the caregivers we spoke to, and that's why, as I said in the presentation, for them proximity was key, because they were always worried for their kids when they leave the home, and how do they even get to these spaces. It's very important to think of the journey of the kids from this recreation space or public space that we're creating to the house. And that's why in the recommendation we suggested this idea of safe links as well, to look at the passages, the journey of the child, the experience of the child being safe, and specifically from traffic and from the road in general. Yeah.
Thanks, Joanna. I see that we're almost at time. I see there's another question from Sarah on finance. And Sarah, I think we're going to get back to you via email after today's call, but I'd like to hand over to Sarah Kadarachi and to Untitled Chapter from the Bernard van Leer Foundation for some closing remarks.
Thanks. Maybe I can start, and then so first of all, I'd like to thank all of you for joining this event, and I'd like to thank the team that, as you saw during the presentation, the number of people with different background expertise that has joined the journey with us. It's not been an easy journey, but it's been an extremely interesting journey. I think we learn a lot, we challenge each other a lot. And we hope that we develop something that is very useful. And for us, today is a very important milestone, because the idea of working together with Bernard van Leer Foundation in this context started a couple of years ago. And the whole idea was based on an idea, on an intuition, on the fact that we saw the need to bring child and family-friendly principles also in vulnerable contexts, because that's where the majority of the population live, that's where a majority of children live, and that's where their needs are not understood, and they're not understood, they're not taken into account by decision makers and planners. And I personally worked for more than 15 years in several vulnerable contexts, informal settlements across the world. So I wanted to see more than delivering functional structure, technical solutions. I wanted to see how can we as urban practitioners, as development experts, can we deliver something that dignifies people living there, that provides an informal learning opportunity for the children and for the population living there. So how can we use better design, nice design, aesthetic, and the knowledge, understanding of those contexts, bring them together to achieve a better outcome. And so I really hope that we manage to achieve that in terms of providing a guidance towards that direction together. And the conscious that the dissemination and the uptake of the guide doesn't happen with the launch. So I think we would like now to work together and see how can we support you, how can we help you better understand these principles that we include in the guide, and to make your own principles, so that you understand that adopting a child family friendly approach in city design and planning or in policy development is not rocket science. It's something that is possible to do. There are great examples around the world that are not seen yet, but there are. And I think COVID-19 has created huge opportunity to actually open our eyes and find alternative solutions that are cost effective, are more community driven, are more nature based, and takes into account the needs of the most vulnerable, because they have a lot to say, they have a lot to share, and that's what I think is the main takeaway, the main learning that we have from the guide. We need to talk with them and to include their ideas in the way that we work. So stay tuned. I think more will come in the future, but in particular to thank the Bernard van Leer Foundation for the great collaboration after so many years of professional work. I think it's been one of the best partners I've ever worked with because of the type of partnership collaboration that is very unique, is very healthy, and is very constructive. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. And, I'd like to say thanks to Arup too. I really think that this is an amazing product, and it's an amazing achievement too, because coming from the urban design world, I think for me, what was interesting was to actually, when I started this journey in the early childhood development, and to bring these two fields together, there is very little out there. And I think that this guide and this guidance has done that. So I think we've already taken a giant leap here. And also, I think what's interesting is that the community-driven approach, and that's very evident in the work that today Civic and CatalyticAction and KDI share, that there is this idea of really community-driven approach. So I will say that there is a lot to be done. These are just a few examples, and we're really looking forward to our partnership together to move further and really think of how do we disseminate this guide, and this guide, like for me, I think what would be amazing is if it becomes the go-to resource for vulnerable contexts, for settlements, or even in general, like in the urban context itself. I think there's a lot to be achieved, because I do feel that it's not just about the idea of care and planning, but the idea that when we design for babies, toddlers, and caregivers, we're designing for everyone. So I really think that this has been an amazing journey, and we are really looking forward to more. So with that, I also want to thank everyone else who's joined us here and went through this event today. And from there, Hannah, I'm gonna hand it over to you to wrap us up and give any more details on how people can get in touch with us.
Sure, no, thanks everybody, and thanks for staying a little bit over time. I'm going to launch a quick poll. So if you are interested in being informed of future events, opportunities, or trainings, please let us know, and we will be sure to reach out to you. The session was recorded, so in case you'd like to share it with colleagues or your network or peers, please feel free. You will receive it via email in the coming day or so. And other than that, please feel free to unmute yourselves and say goodbye, turn on your videos. It's always nice to see a face. And thank you for joining us today.
Goodbye.
Everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.